Imagine a time long ago, a world of stone castles, dense forests, and constant conflict. This was the world of the 15th century, a time when kings and princes fought fiercely to protect their lands. Into this world, a man was born who would become a legend, a name whispered in both fear and respect. His name was Vlad III, but history remembers him by his more famous titles, Vlad Dracula and Vlad the Impaler. He was a prince of Voivode, of a small but proud land called Wallachia, which is part of modern-day Romania. He lived a life that was so dramatic, so filled with brutal battles and shocking deeds that his story would echo through the centuries, blurring the lines between the man he truly was and the monster he would become in stories. Vlad was born around the year 1431 into a noble family locked in a desperate struggle for survival. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was a powerful ruler himself, a member of a special group of Christian knights known as the Order of the Dragon. This order was created to defend Christian Europe from the expanding power of the Ottoman Empire, a vast and mighty force from the east. This conflict defined Vlad's entire existence, from his childhood to his final days. He grew up not in a peaceful palace, but in a world where betrayal was common, where alliances were as fragile as glass, and where the threat of invasion was a constant dark cloud hanging over his homeland. It was this harsh reality that shaped him into the ruler he became. His family life was anything but simple. As a young boy, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent away as political hostages to the court of the Ottoman Sultan. This was a common practice back then, a way to ensure a ruler would keep their promises. For years, Vlad lived among his enemies, learning their language, their culture, and their methods of warfare. This experience must have been terrifying and deeply formative. It taught him about the power, the ambition, and the ruthlessness of the Ottoman court. It filled him with a deep-seated hatred for the empire that held him captive, but it also gave him an invaluable understanding of how his greatest enemy thought and operated. When he finally returned to Wallachia, he was a changed man, determined to secure his throne and protect his people at any cost. He believed that his small country could only survive if it was led by a strong, uncompromising ruler who would not tolerate any dissent or weakness. He saw enemies everywhere, rival nobles who wanted his throne, opportunistic merchants who he felt exploited his people, and of course the ever-present shadow of the Ottoman Empire. His methods for dealing with these threats would become infamous, earning him a reputation for extreme cruelty that would eventually overshadow everything else he accomplished as a leader and a defender of his land. To understand Vlad the Impaler, we must first understand the world he inhabited. Wallachia, his homeland, was a place caught in a precarious position, like a small boat tossed between two gigantic waves. To the west and north lay the Christian kingdoms of Europe, including the powerful Kingdom of Hungary. To the south and east, stretching across vast territories, was the formidable Ottoman Empire. For centuries, these two mighty forces were locked in a struggle for dominance, and Wallachia was right in the middle of it all. It was a borderland, a buffer state, a place where cultures, religions, and armies clashed continuously. Its people lived with the constant threat of war, their survival depending on the cunning and strength of their rulers. Life in 15th century Europe was tough and often brutal. It was a time before modern medicine, before widespread education, and before the laws and rights we know today. Power was everything, and it was often maintained through force. Rulers all across Europe used harsh punishments to keep order. Public executions were common events, designed to scare people into obedience. Torture was a standard tool for interrogation. In this context, a ruler needed to be seen as strong and fearsome to survive. Weakness was an invitation for invasion from neighbors or rebellion from within. The people of Wallachia looked to their prince, their voivode, not for kindness, but for the strength to keep them safe from much larger, more powerful enemies. The Ottoman Empire was one of the greatest powers of the age. Its armies were disciplined, its leaders were ambitious, and its influence was spreading deep into Europe. In 1453, when Vlad was a young man, the Ottomans achieved a stunning victory. They conquered the great city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This event sent shockwaves across the Christian world. It felt as if nothing could stop the Ottoman advance. For a small principality like Wallachia, which shared a long border with the empire along the Danube River, the threat was not abstract, it was immediate and terrifying. The Sultan demanded tribute, money, goods, and even young boys for his army. From from lands like Wallachia to show their submission. It was this immense pressure that forged Vlad's political and military strategies. He knew he could not defeat the entire Ottoman army in a pitched battle. His forces were simply too small. Instead, he had to be clever, ruthless, and unpredictable. He engaged in guerrilla warfare, launching surprise raids, burning crops to deny the enemy food, and poisoning wells. He sought to create an aura of such extreme terror around himself that the massive Ottoman armies would hesitate to enter his lands. His fight for Wallachian independence was not just a series of battles. It was a psychological war, and he was determined to win it by using his enemy's fear as his most powerful weapon. Vlad's journey to becoming the ruler of Wallachia was a rocky and violent path marked by betrayal, exile, and bloodshed. He did not simply inherit his father's throne and rule peacefully. The position of voivoda was not always passed down from father to son. It was often claimed by the strongest noble, frequently with the backing of a foreign power like Hungary or the Ottoman Empire. Vlad had to fight for his right to rule on 3 separate occasions. His first reign was incredibly brief, lasting only a few months in 1448 before he was forced out by a rival. This early failure likely taught him a harsh lesson. To hold power, he needed to be absolutely unforgiving with his enemies. After years in exile, waiting for his moment, Vlad finally seized the throne for his longest and most famous reign in 1456. This time he was determined not to lose it. He immediately began to centralize his power, which meant taking it away from the powerful noble families, known as boyars, who had long challenged the authority of the prince. Many of these boyars had betrayed his father and brother, and Vlad neither forgot nor forgave. According to some stories, he invited hundreds of them to a great feast, and after they had eaten, he had them all arrested. The older ones were impaled on the spot, while the younger, healthier ones were marched off to work as slaves, rebuilding one of his castles. This act set the tone for his entire rule. Vlad believed that Wallachia's weakness came from the constant infighting and disloyalty of its nobles. He wanted to create a new order, one based on absolute loyalty to him and to the nation. He also targeted merchants, particularly the German Saxons from the nearby towns of Transylvania, whom he accused of undermining his authority and damaging Wallachia's economy. He launched brutal raids against their towns, punishing them with the same ferocity he showed the boyars. His goal was to make it clear that there was only one authority in Wallachia, his own. He was creating a state where his word was law and the price for disobeying that law was death. His methods were undeniably cruel, but it is important to remember the violent times he lived in. While his favorite method of execution, impalement, was particularly gruesome, other European rulers used equally horrific punishments, such as hanging, drawing, and quartering. The key difference was the scale and efficiency with which Vlad used his terror tactics. He didn't just punish individuals, he punished entire groups to send a message. He wanted to create a land that was so orderly and so fearful of his justice that, as one legend claims, he could leave a golden cup by a public fountain and no one would dare steal it. For Vlad, this extreme cruelty was a necessary tool for forging a strong, unified nation capable of resisting its enemies. Perhaps the most famous and terrifying story associated with Vlad the Impaler comes from his war against the Ottoman Empire in 1462. The mighty Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, decided he had had enough of Vlad's defiance. He gathered a massive army, said to be one of the largest forces of its time, and marched north to crush the rebellious Wallachian prince once and for all. Vlad knew he could not face such an army in open combat. His own forces were vastly outnumbered. So he resorted to the tactics he knew best: fear, surprise, and psychological warfare on a horrifying scale. He turned the landscape of Wallachia itself into a weapon against the invaders. As the massive Ottoman army advanced, they found a desolate and hostile land. Vlad's forces had burned villages and crops, ensuring there was no food for the invaders to find. They had poisoned wells and diverted streams, leaving the Ottoman soldiers thirsty and sick. Under the cover of darkness, Vlad and his best soldiers would launch daring night raids on the Ottoman camp, creating chaos and panic, killing soldiers in their sleep before melting back into the forests. One of the most audacious of these attacks was a direct assault on the Sultan's own tent, an attempt to assassinate Mehmed himself. While the attempt failed, it sowed deep fear and paranoia among the Ottoman troops, who felt they were fighting a ghostly, unseen enemy. The climax of this campaign of terror came when the Sultan and his army approached Vlad's capital city of Targovist. There, on the plains outside the city, they were met with a sight so grotesque that it has been remembered for over 500 years. Vlad had created a forest not of trees, but of stakes. On these thousands of tall, sharp poles, he had impaled the bodies of his Ottoman prisoners of war, as well as any Wallachians he considered traitors. It was a silent, gruesome army of the dead, stretching for miles. The sight was said to be so shocking, so utterly horrifying, that even the battle-hardened Sultan Mehmed II was stunned and sickened. This gruesome display was Vlad's ultimate psychological weapon. It wasn't just about killing prisoners. It was about sending a clear and terrifying message to the Sultan. It said, "This is what happens to those who invade my land. This is the fate that awaits you and your soldiers. Turn back now, or you will join them." The tactic worked. Although the Ottoman army was militarily superior, their morale was shattered. The campaign became too costly, too difficult, and too psychologically draining. Faced with this specter of unimaginable horror and the continued guerrilla attacks, the Sultan eventually decided to withdraw his army from Wallachia. Vlad had won, not with strength of arms, but with the strength of terror. While Vlad's reputation for cruelty was certainly earned through his own actions, the stories that spread about him were often, wildly exaggerated and twisted. This was a time before newspapers or the internet, when information traveled through word-of-mouth, letters, and a new invention, the printing press. This new technology allowed stories to be copied and spread across Europe faster than ever before. Many of the most gruesome tales about Vlad came from his enemies, who had every reason to paint him as an inhuman monster. They used these stories as propaganda, a way to turn public opinion against him and justify their own actions. His main detractors were the Saxon merchants of Transylvania. Vlad had severely restricted their trading privileges in Wallachia, which had once been very profitable for them. He had also launched several brutal raids on their towns, punishing them for supporting his political rivals. In retaliation, these merchants used the printing presses in Germany to produce pamphlets filled with horrific stories about him. These pamphlets, often illustrated with gruesome woodcut images of impalements and torture, were some of the first bestsellers in history. They described Vlad as a bloodthirsty sadist who enjoyed dining amidst his dying victims and committing unspeakable acts of cruelty for his own amusement. The Turks, his sworn enemies, also had their own tales. Ottoman chronicles depicted him as a cunning but exceptionally cruel foe, a demon who defied the will of the Sultan. These stories, combined with the German pamphlets, created what historians now call the Black Legend of Vlad the Impaler. It was a portrait of a man who was not just a strict ruler, but a deranged monster who delighted in suffering. Stories circulated that he boiled people alive, that he forced mothers to eat their own children, and that he nailed the hats of foreign envoys to their heads when they refused to remove them in his presence. These tales were designed to dehumanize him completely. It is honestly incredibly difficult for historians today to sort the facts from this mountain of propaganda. Did Vlad really dine among the impaled? It's possible as a symbolic act of power, but it's more likely an exaggeration designed to shock the reader. Did he commit all the atrocities listed in the pamphlets? Almost certainly not. Many of the stories were generic horror tales that were also told about other cruel rulers of the time. The reality is that Vlad was a ruthless 15th century warlord fighting for his nation's survival. His enemies, however, used the power of storytelling to transform him into something far more sinister, a timeless symbol of evil itself. The names we use to remember Vlad III are just as interesting as his life story, and honestly, they tell us a lot about how his family, his people, and his enemies saw him. His most famous name, Dracula, wasn't something he picked for himself. He got it from his dad. In 1431, the year Vlad was born, his father Vlad II joined a special group of Christian knights called the Order of the Dragon. This group was started by the Holy Roman Emperor to protect Christianity from the Ottoman Empire. Members of this group wore a dragon symbol, and Vlad II was so proud of this honor that he took the name Dracul, In the Romanian language back then, Dracul meant the dragon. So, his son Vlad III naturally became known as Dracula, which just means son of the dragon. At first this was a name of honor, connecting him to a noble Christian cause and a powerful family history. But the Romanian language was changing. Over time, the word drac also started to mean devil. This double meaning was super handy for his enemies. They could take his honorable title, son of the dragon, and twist it to mean son of the devil. This language trick really helped make his scary reputation stick, turning a symbol of knightly pride into a sign of pure evil. His other famous name, Tepes, pronounced Tsepesh, came later and was given to him by his enemies. This is a Romanian word that means the impaler. It directly points to his favorite way of executing people impalement, which is when you stick a person with a long, sharp pole. While other rulers used this harsh punishment, Vlad used it so much and on such a huge scale that it became his main thing. The name was first used in Ottoman writings years after he died. This shows how much deep and lasting fear he caused for his Turkish enemies. For them, he wasn't the son of the dragon, he was just the impaler. So, we have two names that tell two very different stories. Dracula was his birthright, a name connected to his family's importance and their promise to defend their faith. It was a name of history and power. Tepes, on the other hand, was a name born from fear, a label given to him by those who had felt his anger. It described not who he was, but what he did. Together, these two names show the two sides of the man himself. The noble Christian prince who fought for his country's freedom, and the terrifying ruler who used unbelievable cruelty to get what he wanted. He was both the dragon's son and the impaler. For centuries after his death, Vlad the Impaler remained a figure in Romanian history and folklore, remembered as a cruel but effective ruler who defended his land. He was a hero to some, a tyrant to others, but he was always a man. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century, more than 400 years after his death, that his story was completely transformed. This transformation was the work of an Irish author named Bram Stoker. In 1897, Stoker published a novel that would become one of the most famous horror stories of all time. This book took the historical Prince of Wallachia and turned him into a supernatural monster, an undead vampire. Bram Stoker never actually visited Romania. He did most of his research in libraries in London, reading books about the history and folklore of Eastern Europe. He came across the name Dracula and learned a few basic facts about the real Vlad, that he was a voivode from a land bordering the Ottoman Empire and that he had a reputation for cruelty. The name itself, with its hint of the word devil, must have seemed perfect for his villain. Stoker borrowed the name and a few vague details from history, but almost everything else about his character, Count Dracula, was pure fiction, drawn from vampire myths and legends from across Europe. It is crucial to understand the difference between the real man and the fictional character. The historical Vlad the Impaler was not a vampire. He did not drink blood, he could not turn into a bat, and he did not live in a spooky castle in Transylvania. He was the Prince of Wallachia, a different region. He was a mortal man who lived, fought, and died in the 15th century. Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, on the other hand, is an immortal, supernatural creature of the night. Stoker created a compelling villain by merging the fearsome name of a real historical figure with the ancient folklore of the undead. Thanks to Stoker's novel and the countless films, TV shows and books it inspired, the name Dracula is now known all over the world. However, this fame has come at a cost. The fictional vampire has almost completely erased the real historical man from popular memory. When people hear the name Dracula, they think of capes, fangs and coffins, not of a 15th century prince fighting a desperate war for his people's independence. The line between the history of Vlad Tepes and the legend of Count Dracula has become incredibly blurred, creating one of the most fascinating mixtures of fact and fiction in modern culture. So, who was the real Vlad? If we strip away the vampire legends and the enemy propaganda, what kind of man is left? The historical Vlad III was a product of his violent, treacherous times. He was a medieval ruler with a singular overriding goal: to secure the independence of his homeland Wallachia and to establish his own absolute authority over it. He saw his country being crushed between two superpowers, Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and torn apart from within by feuding nobles. He concluded that the only path to survival was through absolute order, an order that had to be enforced with absolute terrifying power. In many ways, Vlad was a deeply religious man and a patriot. He saw himself as a champion of Christianity, a shield against the expansion of the Ottoman Empire into Europe. He founded and donated money to several monasteries, which was a typical act of piety for a Christian ruler of his time. In Romania today, many people do not see him as a monster at all. Instead, he is often viewed as a national hero, a stern and demanding father figure who did what was necessary to protect his country from foreign domination. They remember him not for his cruelty, but for his fierce resistance against overwhelming odds, his refusal to bow to the Sultan, and his fight for national sovereignty. His personal life was turbulent and tragic. He spent his formative years as a hostage, saw his father and older brother betrayed and murdered, and had to fight relentlessly for his throne. He was eventually captured by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, and spent more than a decade as a prisoner in Hungary. This long period of captivity must have deepened his bitterness and paranoia. When he was finally released and regained his throne for a third time in 1476, his rule was cut short. He was killed in battle only a few months later, his life ending as violently as it had been lived. Ultimately, Vlad was a complex and contradictory figure. He was a defender of his people who used unimaginable cruelty against them to enforce order. He was a pious Christian who committed acts that many would call demonic. He was a cunning military strategist and a ruthless politician. He was not a one-dimensional villain or a saintly hero. He was a man forged in the crucible of 15th century warfare and politics, a leader who believed that extreme measures were justified to achieve a greater good, the survival of his nation. The historical Vlad is far more complicated and perhaps more interesting than any monster. As we look back at the story of Vlad the Impaler, it becomes clear that we are dealing with two very different figures. First, there is Vlad III Dracula, the historical voivode of Wallachia. He was a real person, a 15th century prince who ruled with an iron fist. He was a brutal man, even by the harsh standards of his own time, and he used terror as a deliberate tool of statecraft. His use of mass impalement against his enemies, both foreign and domestic, is a matter of historical record. He was a fierce defender of his homeland's independence against the mighty Ottoman Empire, a fact that has made him a national hero in his native Romania. Then there is Count Dracula, the fictional character created by Bram Stoker. This Dracula is a creature of pure fantasy. He is an aristocratic vampire from Transylvania, an undead nobleman who feeds on the blood of the living, possesses supernatural powers, and represents a timeless form of evil and forbidden desire. While Stoker borrowed Vlad's name and a sliver of his fearsome reputation, the vampire of literature and film has almost nothing to do with the real man who lived and died over 500 years ago. The connection between them is a historical accident, a literary choice that forever linked a Wallachian prince to a universal monster. The challenge for us as readers of history is to learn to see the line that separates the man from the myth. It is easy to let the exciting, terrifying legend of the vampire overshadow the more complex and often more difficult truth of the historical figure. The pamphlets printed by his enemies exaggerated his cruelty for political reasons, creating a black legend that painted him as a blood-crazed madman. Later, Bram Stoker's novel took that legend and spun it into a supernatural horror story. Both layers of storytelling have obscured the reality of the man beneath. Therefore, when you hear the name Dracula, it is worth taking a moment to ask, which one are we talking about? Are we talking about the historical prince, Vlad Tepes, a complex and brutal leader from a violent age? Or are we talking about the fictional vampire, Count Dracula, one of the most enduring monsters in all of literature? By keeping these two identities separate, we can better appreciate the fascinating real history of the Prince of Wallachia, while still enjoying the thrilling make-believe horror of the King of Vampires. One is history, the other is a story, and knowing the difference makes both far more interesting.